Morning.
Morning.
It's Thursday, May 1st. Happy May Day, everyone. We are starting our morning with H504, and then we're going to do some more work on tax increment financing districts. And then we have our vote scheduled for S51. And then after the floor, we might or might not have a joint hearing. So stay tuned. Tucker, thank you so much for drafting these amendments for us. I think they're pretty fun. Before you take us through them, I remember that Representative Higley had a question about how we declare tax rates.
Yes, good morning. For the record, Tucker Anderson, Legislative Counsel. To start with Representative Higley's question about whether the on the dollar expression of the tax rate is either inferior to or consistent with other expressions of tax rate, including per 100. And after consulting with Kirby, taking a look at the way that these rates are expressed elsewhere in statute, there's no consistent phrase that's used. Kirby did relay that expressing the tax rate on the dollar is at least a percentage that is identifiable, and that this is an appropriate way to do that. And it's actually preferable, at least according to his expertise, to the per 100 expression of tax rates. So the amendment doesn't contain changes to the way that the tax rate is expressed in the charter because it's appropriate and seems to be at least as consistent as all the other ways that tax rates are expressed in Vermont statute.
Thanks.
Perfect. So I will share my screen. This should be fairly easy, because most of this is technical. So the first instance of amendment strikes the use of the word police in subdivision 7 of section 8.5. And that is because there would now be 2 areas in the charter where police equipment is funded by these, baseline taxes on the grand list. And since there is an independent tax just for police equipment, the city relayed, hey, that reference to police equipment in subdivision 7 is supposed to be struck. So that is now eliminated in that subdivision. The second instance of amendment, wow, very critical. It gets rid of that superfluous 0 at the end of the tax rate in subdivision. So,
yeah. Which is nothing compared to section 2A.
I will say that Representative Pincinel was very frustrated by that extra 0 as the bill was leaving House Government Operations. So she'll be very pleased that you have eliminated the extra 0. So the third instance of amendment redesignates the town of West Rutland charter from chapter 155E to chapter 162 by way of explanation. Last biennium, the town of Waterbury adopted their first charter, and there was no room for the town of Waterbury in Title 24 appendix, and we had to reorganize a whole bunch of chapters so that they would continue to be in alphabetical order. However, there was this secret charter, the charter that wasn't, and that's the town of West Rutland, which you would only know exists in Vermont statute if you pulled out not the Green Book sections itself, but the indices to Title 24 appendix, where you would see that it had been given chapter 155E, but there was no charter and no text of the charter, just a history note that at some point a charter was approved by the voters. So it was missed. And we have a random chapter 155E sitting completely out of chapter order and alphabetical order. So there were members of particularly Senate Government Operations that were very upset and frustrated by things being out of alphabetical order.
And so yesterday I received an email from a member of the Senate who asked me if we would mind adding this to our amendment. I think perhaps Tucker might have notified them that we were touching Rutland.
The question that comes up frequently, when can we fix the West Rutland charter designation? And
Thank you for all that.
so that I had just left this committee and I said, there's actually a Rutland charter in the House right now where this could be fixed. So
Thank you so much for your cross-chamber collaboration support.
I raise flags when necessary.
Yes, I
I'm
Yes,
I'm
Representative
so loath to
Wozniak.
ask the question. I'm just, what do you mean there wasn't room for the Waterbury Charter?
We had used all of the chapter 155 designations with letters A through F or something like that. And there was nowhere for Waterbury to go in that A through F without causing the charters to be out of alphabet order.
Okay.
No G.
Well, that would have put Waterbury after, for example, Weybridge, which would just.
Well, that would. Ah,
This is anyone.
and we thought ed financing was a mess, Gene.
No further questions for Tucker. Thank you very much for your work, Tucker. What's the draft number? Sorry.
2.1.
Madam Chair, I would move that we find version 2.1 of the amendment to H 504 favorable as presented.
Thank you. Are you moving that we amend H 504?
Yeah, that's the right thing.
Okay. Representative Kimball is moving that we amend H 504 with version 2.1,
One.
2.1, as presented.
No.
Any discussion? Seeing none, if the clerk could please call the roll.
Representative Brannigan.
Yes.
I'll vote yes. Is Representative Burkhardt, Representative Feltes.
Yes.
Representative Higley,
Yes.
Representative Holcomb,
Yes.
Representative Kimball,
Yes.
Representative Maslin.
Yep.
Representative Odie is not here. Representative Wazazak,
Yes.
Representative Canfield,
Yes.
and Representative Kornheiser.
Yes,
We have voted the bill favorable with amendment.
we have not. We still need to vote the bill.
Oh, sorry. We have voted favorably on the amendment to the bill.
Thank you.
I would now move, Madam Chair, that we approve 504 as amended.
Thank you. Representative Kimball moves that we approve H 504 as amended. Any discussion? Seeing none, clerk, please call the roll.
Representative Brannigan.
Yes.
I'll vote yes. Is Representative Burkhardt, Representative Feltes.
Yes.
Representative Higley,
Yes.
Representative Holcomb.
Yes.
Representative Kimball.
Yes.
Representative Maslin.
Yep.
Representative Odie still, well, absent. Representative Wazazak,
Yes.
Representative Canfield,
Yes.
and Representative Kornheiser.
Yes.
Now we have voted the bill favorable with amendment 1001.
Thank you so much. Representative Higley, will you report this?
Sure.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. I think it'll be a pleasure. And with that theme, we are turning to tax increment financing. Ted, do you want to join the Zoom and,
Yes.
oh, on your way. Look at that, magic. We can pick up halfway through that presentation from yesterday.
Exactly.
Delightful. Glad I broke it up across 2 days.
Ted Burnett, Joint Fiscal Office. I don't know, however, I'm gonna follow charter changes in alphabetical order and whatnot. Those are tall shoes.
I yield to me.
I don't think so.
I have a lot of tall shoes in the drawer.
Oh, I thought just don't, yeah.
It's absolutely May, we're all losing.
I'm now in full screen mode. Okay, great.
All order.
So yes, the second part of what I was planning to talk with you all about is background growth rates in context of TIF, and I imagine in a project-based TIF example, right? Thinking about TIF really, if you're trying to evaluate how the trajectory of a TIF, property value growth in a TIF, you need something to compare it to, right? And so folks will use the phrase background growth rates to refer to the rate of growth that was occurring in a community before a TIF was created. And so I'm going to run through 3 different ways of thinking about background growth rates. 2 of them are within looking at grand list growth. So there's total listed value. So Jake Feldman did some work looking at kind of long-term growth rates and total listed value to really look at development and investment, new value created through construction, renovation, et cetera. And then we're going to pivot to looking at background growth rates in education property tax. And then I did also wanted to provide some information about housing unit creation, right? Because the CHIP proposal that may be headed your way, who knows, is primarily focused on housing, right? And so looking at, there is some data about the rate and pace of housing unit creation in the state, and keeping that in mind is helpful when thinking about how much housing could be created through a tax increment financing structure versus what's already existing. So the first piece is this growth in total listed value. And so Jake Feldman did the work. It was really a big lift, and so credit to him in sharing this data. But this is looking at the value of growth that's resulting from new construction, renovation, right? Are kind of this is and stripping out appreciation and value that may have come from reappraisals. Do want to flag that this is the whole universe, right? This isn't limited to residential construction. This is commercial, industrial development, everything that's being added to the grand list from construction. And the long-term averages do show limited growth through this lens. Basically, almost all of the jurisdictions analyzed, this includes some GORs, which is why it's more than the number you may be used to seeing. In grants, 251 had a growth rate below 2%, and 111 of the 260 had a growth rate below 1%. And so this table shows that a lion's share of the jurisdictions that were analyzed by Jake from this 2004 to 2024 time period are sitting between 0.5% of growth year over year and 1% growth year over year. And then we have 83 jurisdictions sitting between 1% and 1.5%. And so when folks are referring to growth in the grand list, they may be referring to this type of growth. And when they're making the case that growth in the grand list in Vermont has been relatively stagnant, this is the piece. And there's certainly evidence showing that the rate of growth from construction and renovation is slower than what you're used to seeing on an Ed Fund Outlook, for example. So
Just to clarify, this is 2% per year.
per year, exactly, not overall.
Not
Yes.
overall.
Yep,
Okay.
yep,
Thank you.
exactly.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah.
Wait, can you go back to it again so I can look at it?
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And so in the JFO TIF report, in order to create the cleanest comparison to what would have happened in absence of a TIF, this is work that was done by Grant Campbell in the previous JFO TIF report that came out in but carried it forward for consistency. He looked at the background growth rates of the CLA adjusted growth in a TIF district in the years running up before the district was created to get a sense of this background growth rate of the trajectory of properties within the TIF district. So this is looking whenever those data were available, right? Looking specifically at the parcels that were in the TIF district, seeing what they were growing at year over year, and then comparing the kind of the JFO model that's at the core of the report compares these background growth rates or, you know, baseline growth assumptions against what actually happened, the value and increment that was delivered through the TIF, to get a sense of what value was provided to the education fund through whatever, right, the percent that's remitted to the education fund, how that amount compares to what would have been delivered if they just continued at their current trajectory.
Ted, in that, this is the CLA adjusted, so
Correct.
that takes into account the appreciation in the market.
Exactly. This is important, right? Because when Julia is setting the yields and working together with tax to come to consensus, right? The December 1 letter, everyone's starting from the equalized grant list. And so that is an important piece of looking at the value, particularly in the education fund perspective, that would be delivered through both appreciation and background or construction and renovation. There are varying rates of growth through this analysis. St. Albans, for example, 2.23% in between 2003 and 2011. Representative Pulse, these are year-over-year growth rates. It's not overall. And yes, and then you run all the way up to Hartford and Burlington, that we're seeing much higher rates of background growth. I do want to, at this point, talk a little bit about kind of the challenges in the counterfactual here. This is looking at the growth rates that were occurring before a TIF district was created. In a purely counterfactual sense, you would know, right, in, let's say, South Burlington, what the growth rates were currently, right? And this is not to say that in 2024 or 2025, this is the background growth rates would be this. It's just the best approximation we have to look at this growth. So counterfactual is tricky. Also, unsurprisingly, because this analysis does include appreciation, it is higher than looking at the analysis that's only looking at the value that's provided by construction or renovation.
Can I ask a little bit about that counterfactual? Because, you see the growth rate is different even within Burlington for different parts. And, what I've read some of the stuff from the Lincoln Land Institute, and one of the effects that they've documented is that sometimes you see exacerbated growth within the TIF district at the expense of the surrounding areas. So my question is, have you compared these communities to places that fall just outside the actual TIF district and compared rates of growth in those?
That is a fantastic summer project. That would be a huge data lift. I think that's interesting. I think part of the struggle also with the counterfactual in those cases, right, is that towns, even surrounding a TIF district, have different readiness for growth, perspectives on growth. And right, so when you're creating a TIF district, it's really signaling this is a place that we've designated, we're interested in development happening. And so even the outlying communities might have a different trajectory for growth. And so it makes counterfactual comparisons between those two places tricky.
100%.
Yeah.
It was just about looking at more sources, because effectively, this is a unique situation because unlike other states, we have a statewide education fund.
Yes.
So you're forcing other communities to pay for development in some communities. And particularly when it's redistributing growth within the state and not actually creating new growth, you're making people pay to redistribute. You're not making people pay to grow.
Representative Wilkins, you have a question?
No, I'm just saying, what are the other counterfactuals? Yes, I do, but it's a summer project.
I think another piece, what some of the studies that the Lincoln Land Institute looked at, right, are they are able to pull their evidence from places in the Midwest that have a much larger sample size of TIF districts. So they're able to do that counterfactual analysis. They have enough communities that did not do a TIF that resemble communities that did do a TIF, and they have a large enough kind of grouping within those two pieces to be able to do the rigorous statistical analysis.
I have another question. I do. I noticed yesterday when they were discussing the St. Albans TIF, they said that a single change in property, the federal building that was used for immigration, whatever, was responsible for something like an 8 million decline from 66 million to 50, whatever, in the expected growth rate. To what extent are these percentages very unstable, because these TIFs are so small anyway, that one or two property investments could make a big difference in those percentages?
That is good. I mean, right, it depends on the size of the TIF. Like the Burlington downtown TIF is pretty large. And I would say that's probably more stable than Killington, was right there. Their original taxable value. You'll see here, and this actually brings up something maybe I should mention about the differences in periods, where in some places we're able to do kind of a period of CLA adjusted growth within the TIF district, whereas Killington, it's the overall rate of growth in the overall town. Because the parcel in Killington, the OTV changed over time, there wasn't a clear sense of the growth in those parcels because they were, the larger ski areas, they're maybe getting split apart and changed or subdivided. And so in some cases, so exactly to Killington's point, we use the town because it's a larger area and a more stable comparison compared to what was happening within the parcels that are in the TIF district.
Back to you.
Great. So
Yes, question about that.
Yep.
So I think the Killington one, I really struggle with, because we're basically helping to build a ski village. And I'm mindful that in my own community, second homes pay a tax rate that's about 50 cents lower. So even the development value isn't the same as the tax value. Have you also looked at the tax value in terms of, are we building second homes versus homesteads, and what the revenue is to the ed fund associated with different kinds of development? Because actual growth in base, if you're paying a lower rate, is not the same as building homes that people actually live in. That bring more kids to our schools. I mean, I'm just wondering if you've looked at it that way too.
I think this is, unfortunately, right, this is not a surprise to the committee. There's real difficulty in understanding what's happening in the non-homestead piece of, so like in your split between homestead and non-homestead, primarily what's happening in growth of increment in TIF districts is on the non-homestead side. It's hard to parcel out what piece of that is housing creation versus commercial development. I'd have to go through like individual, I haven't done it, but I would have to go through individual like financing plans and compare them to what actually happened within districts. So the answer is no, haven't done that analysis. The next piece, so this is pivoting away from growth and grand list to a nifty data resource, which is the US Census Bureau has a survey that attempts to understand the number of housing units that were permitted in an area in a given period of time. And you can look at the statewide level, you can look at different statistical areas. And so this is the best information we have about the trajectory of housing units that are permitted to be built in the state. We'll note that these, because it's permitted, right, there's a bit of lag in the data you're seeing and between when they're permitted, right, and when they actually are built and come online and add value to that list. Using those data, there were about 2,500 new housing units permitted in 2024 in the state. That is certainly an improvement from post-financial crisis. The post-financial crisis decrease in housing unit creation, right? You could see on this graph, starting, it looks like in 2006 or 2007, you really see the rate of housing unit creation decrease pretty substantially, and then take a very long time to recover as the broader economy was recovering from the Great Recession. We'll say that this trend is not unique to Vermont. Nearly everywhere else in the country saw a similar crash in housing unit creation and then a relatively slow recovery. And that's why many places are having housing crisis.
Representative Messlin?
Yeah, thank you. So what do we learn from what you just told us? There's a lag between permitted and actual built.
Mm-hmm.
What are the lessons that we can learn in Vermont?
This is, I don't know if I would be necessarily, I don't know if I would say there's any kind of concrete lesson aside from to say that lag means that these data aren't showing us that we have 2,500 new housing units that were available to folks.
Just what they show and nothing more.
They show this is the amount that were permitted, and certainly there might be a lag, and B, you might have units that were permitted, but it takes time to actually break ground. Maybe they were permitted, but financing fell through. So mainly want to make the case that because this says 2,500 new housing units, it's not that they were created, just that they were permitted.
Vermont is not atypical.
Certainly in the broader trend of like housing unit creation, I don't think Vermont is atypical.
Thank you very much.
And so I think there's kind of a glass half full, glass half empty way of looking at this number of 2,500 units, right? On the one hand, you could say 2,500 new housing units permitted is a substantial increase from where we were in 2010, 2015. And so that's good news. The market is responding to intense demand, and so we're starting to see an improvement in housing unit creation. That is the glass half full. The glass half empty is that rate of 2,500 units is well below what was identified in the housing needs assessment to provide enough housing for Vermonters and folks who want to move to Vermont. And so that the 2025 housing needs assessment identified that in order to catch up with really high demand currently, there would need to be 25,000 to 36,000 units created by 2029. The other fun piece of this data that I did want to note is that within the overall, the survey breaks the numbers of units permitted by the number of units within a structure. So you see the total all the way on the left. One unit is referring to single family home creation, right? So we have one unit that's being created and permitted as part of the structure. And then there's this, all the way on the right, you have buildings that are units permitted in a building that contains 5 units or more. So apartment buildings, condominiums, et cetera. And so the growth that is occurring in this total amount of housing unit creation is largely coming from this category over here of 5 units or more. And this is exactly the type of project that would need infrastructure investment and could leverage a project type program. In addition to the number of units, this survey also considers the value of that construction. And so in 2024, $650 million in new private construction permitted. Of that figure, 184 million came from, is represented in structures with 3 or more units. And comparing this increase, there's unsurprisingly, right, the creation in value outstrips the, in 5 units or more, outstrips kind of the total increase. And when thinking about TIF, if they're used for housing unit creation, as the median price increases, the potential costs or risks to the education fund increases because that incremental value amount is larger as we have more expensive construction and sales. So the final piece, wanted to mention in these data that they do provide looks into statistical areas. So wanted to share how the Burlington statistical area, the data from that part of the state compares to the state more broadly. For reference, the statistical area includes the counties of Chittenden, Grand Isle, and Franklin. In 2024, they represented 43.5% of housing unit creation in the state. This share changes depending on the type of construction. So the Burlington MSA represented a smaller portion of single unit creation, but a larger percentage of 5 or more units, which makes sense seeing the construction that's happening in Burlington. A lot of it is apartments, condominiums, larger buildings and structures, and so wanted to show that differential within Burlington. The other piece, and maybe I'll breeze through this relatively quickly. There has been a lot of action on housing reforms and exemptions, and within thinking about housing and the rate of growth of housing, folks have mentioned kind of there are a lot of constraints in housing unit creation, right? And so there's a regulatory piece and there's a cost piece. And so it is possible, right, that permitting process and was slowing down developments, and right, there's been a lot of action in making it easier to build from a regulatory standpoint. And did want to note that if you ever want to cruise around, you can see the Land Use Review Board and DHCD produced a map showing places where potential areas, they're very clear to mention that these are potential areas where housing may be built without triggering Act 250. And yes, so this piece of it's hard to know how many projects are constrained by regulatory barriers, cost barriers, or both. There is evidence that regulatory reforms are having a positive effect, right? Some builders are able to complete projects and are taking advantage of the exemptions that were created in recent legislation. And so in thinking about our counterfactual, again, or background growth rates, it is possible that projects, depending on how, right, how the bill ends up, that projects that were facing regulatory barriers are able to move forward, but still participate in a CHIP program because they have infrastructure costs, a CHIP type program. So all of these changes on the regulatory side make it harder to understand where our trend of housing unit creation will go, right? It's hard to know how effective these reforms will be, how many folks are able to build as a result of easing these restrictions. And so the 2,500 units I mentioned could be higher simply as a result of removing regulatory barriers.
And is there ever a true up between what's permitted and what's actually constructed? Again, I know, and I don't know, I was gonna ask the mayor yesterday when he was talking about his project. A lot of times, you get halfway into a project and rather than having, 45 residential units and 35 rentals, something has to change to make it a viable project. I'm just wondering if there's ever a true up that's done. What you actually end up with, what was maybe permitted for.
I will look into the census methodology to see if they're doing true ups in that way. Yes, because I'm not sure and I don't want to answer off the cuff. Yeah, I'll look into it.
And I think VHFA is joining us probably next week.
Okay.
And because they did that huge housing needs assessment, I think they've looked at a lot of the state level data on this, and that might be a good question for them.
Okay, great.
Yes, and that's it. That is all I have for y'all today.
Thanks. Any further questions for Doug? Yeah.
Just, I don't see it on our webpage. Is it gonna be eventually just?
Oh, it was yesterday and
Yes.
sort of, it's posted now. Yeah.
Sorry.
Great, no problem.
Yeah.
I have a question. In your presentations, there's no, from the TIF districts, no data point on the number of housing units created within those TIF districts. Is that correct?
So I will say those data are in BEPC annual TIF reports.
Number of the housing units created.
I'm pretty sure, yes.
Okay.
So I would look into, I can send Sorsha a link to those reports. They might also be on the website already. But I'm pretty sure those data are provided in those reports.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks. So Jill and Chloe, hello.
Good morning. Can you folks hear me? This is Jill.
Hi. And my understanding is, I don't know if we've had Chloe testify in Ways and Means in a very long time, so we would like to officially welcome her back. Good to see you.
Yes, I've been hiding.
I am happy for you about that.
All right. Good morning. My name is Jill Remick. I'm the Director of Property Valuation and Review. Chloe, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Chloe Wexler, and I am an analyst at the tax department.
Great, thanks. So Chloe and I just have a few slides and a table to share with you all. We were asked to come in and just articulate, sort of clear up for you all what happens with TIF districts in the intersection with reappraisals. And so just sort of as a reminder, complete reappraisals that happen in Vermont are now happening on a 6-year cycle, which is a very good thing for several reasons, but obviously still not the same as a 100% reappraisal of every property every year. That would be great, but largely impossible. So what we do have is our regular reappraisal 6-year cycle. And TIF districts are no different than other municipalities or particular parcels in regards to reappraisal. So I think, Chloe, if you don't mind, do you have your?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think first I have a couple of different options of what we could discuss today, but I think, and I spoke with Ted yesterday, and I think the committee has a fairly good understanding of TIF, but I just wanted to sort of kind of like see if you want us to set the stage, or because I do have sort of like an introductory PowerPoint, or we can just go into sort of like an example of discussing, sort of just walking through an example of a TIF district in a reappraisal year.
I'm sort of fascinated how every single witness's introductory remarks on TIF are different from each other. And so I'm tempted to actually have us retread that ground, if you don't mind, Chloe.
Sure. And what I would be sharing is a presentation that I actually provided for VEPC, for the VEPC board. And it is actually very specifically targeted at what the tax department's role in TIF is.
That will be very helpful then. Thank you.
Okay. So I didn't actually send any materials to Sorsha because I didn't know exactly where we were going to go yet. So am I able to share my screen?
In one moment.
Okay.
I've already made her co-host. You are a co-host. Go for it.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
I know, so much power.
Okay. Well, yeah, I just had to figure out how to share it.
It's the green one with the arrow.
Yep. So advanced. Do I need to do advanced sharing options? No. Share. Oh, okay, yeah, and I can just share an application window. Okay, share. So you guys can see my PowerPoint now,
Yes.
I think. And can I run the PowerPoint? How do I do that? All right, well, why is that not an option? Slideshow. Okay, from beginning. So like I said, this is a presentation I gave in August, so I haven't changed the date, but here we go. So basically, again, here, just like really trying to sort of like just here's an intro. This is basically an introduction to PVNR, which I don't think you need. So we can potentially skip this slide, but this is just really high level information. We have a statewide property tax. The Division of Property Valuation and Review oversees the administration and municipal coordination of this statewide program. And PVR staff include office staff and traveling, district advisors that work directly with the towns. So we can skip this one. Basically, again, here, just acknowledging that PVNR hosts the software, that enables that sort of facilitates this statewide system. The system facilitates the collection of municipal and education property tax and is used by every municipality in the state. In addition to compiling, aggregating, and publicizing the statewide grand list data, this system manages all the data required to generate and issue property tax bills, including but not limited to current use enrollments, homestead declarations, statutory and locally voted exemptions, and then tax increment financing districts, which is what we will discuss today. And then just a note that grand list is property values divided by 100. So this is actually, I think this is just helpful to sort of like set the stage for the rest of this conversation, which is an overview of assessment terms. So you start with your appraised value. You take out any statutory exemptions. So, you know, again, they're denoting that this is just statutory exemptions. And then you get a taxable value, which is used for the education of, you know, the assessment of education property. And then towns may elect to have, you know, vote additional exemptions, such as an additional 30K for veterans exemptions or a tax stabilization agreement. And those are exemptions that are only at the municipal level, and they do not factor into the town's total education liability. Okay, so this is just a summary of what a TIF district is, which I think we can skip. So again, here's just a very, very brief example. So, you know, when a TIF district is created, the original taxable value, OTV, is determined. And this is the value of all the property within the district prior to any development. So in this example, we're saying the OTV is $500,000. Each year, the current taxable value of all properties in the TIF district is compared to the OTV to determine the increment. So current value minus the original taxable value, which is sometimes referred to as base value, if you hear that. In this example, you know, in this made up example, the increment is 250K. And this is the nuance that you may be familiar with just from the statute and from discussions, but if the increment is positive, the municipality may be eligible to retain a percentage of the property tax revenue generated on the increment in a TIF fund. If the increment is negative, which can sometimes happen in the first couple of years of a district, right? If the district is predicated on a property development, and in year one they have to demolish the existing property, like they may have a decrement in year 1 or 2. But the statute and the rule is very clear that the municipality is sort of like, I don't know, on the hook seems like the wrong word, but you know, that's essentially what it is obligated to remit to the education fund no less than the revenue on the original taxable value. So obviously, if the TIF district was experiencing a decrement, the retention percentage would not be applied and no revenue would be available for the TIF fund. So that's just like another nuance, but we're using you know, a sort of a normal example in which the increment is positive and there is revenue available for the TIF fund. So again, here our increment was 250K. The retention percentage is 70%, assuming a tax rate of $1.50. There is about $262,000 available for based on the TIF increment. And then it's okay. Now here we sort of get into like, again, sort of like what is PBR's role in TIF, right? Because we don't administer the program. What we do is we really provide the software that enables towns to manage their education grand list. And then mechanically, because the TIF program is provided as a property tax exemption, VEPC does not uniquely send money to the towns, but rather PBR administers an exemption to the town's education grand list, which enables them to remit less money than they were previously obligated to the state education fund. And that's the revenue that's available for them to place into their TIF fund. Any questions here?
No, thank
Okay.
you. Also, Chloe's gonna send us the slides. I see lots of people taking pictures this
Oh,
week.
sorry. Yes, I will send you the slides. Yeah, and my apologies. Like I said, I
No,
wasn't
it's fine.
exactly sure where we were gonna go.
It's fine. And please don't feel obligated to update the date on it.
Okay.
Representative Holcomb, you had a question?
Okay.
So I'm just curious because the framing here is different than some of the other people have presented. And I think I used the word moral hazard yesterday, but I'm concerned because we often say that TIF doesn't cost anything, but it seems here that you're saying that they're not putting money into the ed fund, so it is costing something. Who's paying for this?
Oh, I mean, it's like any property tax exemption, right? It basically essentially means that there is revenue that is foregone from the education fund to support, you know, I guess like statutorily determined exemptions and programs, you know, current use, qualified housing, you know, other exemption types that are available to towns, including TIF. So you're absolutely right. Sorry, go ahead.
I think if I understand you, what you're saying is the state and the municipality makes the decision about how to spend, but it's paid for by property taxpayers in school budgets.
Yeah, I guess, yes. I mean, I wouldn't, maybe not so far as in school budgets, but it is money that has to be, it is foregone revenue to the education fund. So I guess in a sense that does sort of like trickle down to school budgets.
Representative Odie.
So, not to put you on the spot, but
No,
are
that's
there more
fine.
than education, and are there more than property taxes in the education fund?
Yes. And this would be, do you remember when Julia comes in with her education fund outlook? And you see that there's a bunch of different sources that come into the education fund. Property taxes are the largest portion of them, but the education fund also receives the sales tax. It receives a third of the purchase and use tax. It receives some other smaller tax types. There's a lot of federal monies that go into the education fund. Maybe review the education fund outlook to see all the sources. But
Are you, I don't know if you know this, but are you aware of other states that when they fund their, when they figure out how they're going to encourage growth of grand list, use more than their property taxes?
I do not know the answer to that question.
Representative Odie, I think that would be a great question to ask of the VEPSI team that we're going to hear from in just a little bit.
Okay. I want to be sure that I'm understanding when I'm thinking about this, that this burden could be considered to be on the property tax, could also be considered to be on the sales tax, which is also aggressive.
So Chloe and Jill are here to explain how the tax department administers this system. So let us stay focused on that.
Okay. All right. So again, I think the nuance here is really in that PVR's role is just administering this property tax exemption. So again, just going back to our very rudimentary example. So here we're going to say that the total education grand list for our fictitious town is $1 million. The education tax rate is again $1.50, which means that the revenue obligated to the state education fund would be $1.5 million. But this town has a TIF district. And again, recalling from our example previously, the increment was $250K with a retention percentage of 70%, which means that we would apply a TIF exemption to their total education grand list that is valued at 70% of 250K, which is in this example, 175K. So the education, this would reduce the town's total education grand list to 825K, which means that the revenue obligated to the education fund would now be 1.24 million, which is 260K less than it otherwise would have been, which is that revenue that is available to them for their TIF fund. So any questions on the mechanics here?
Yes.
Thank you, Chloe. I understand the mechanics. I just want to make the point that then for the Ways and Means Committee sitting in Montpelier, we still are looking to find 1.5 million from somewhere. And if this community is sending us 1.2, then we've got to get the rest of it either from, if we have a good year on sales tax, that's great. If we don't, my concept is that the only other flexible way that we can manipulate to get that additional money is the property tax.
Yeah, and every year actually, JFO and the tax department in sort of their consensus revenue forecast for I think JFC, they do provide an estimate for the cost, you know, the foregone revenue of TIF to the education fund. So I believe that's been on the order of magnitude of around, $6 to $8 million for the past couple of fiscal years.
Right.
So just to give you an idea of, that is the amount of revenue that is being foregone from the education fund to support these tax increment financing districts.
Thank you.
No problem. And yeah, that is up, that revenue, the number is updated annually. It's sort of in the January meeting. So.
Thanks, Chloe.
Okay. So again, this is just going back to PBNR's role in this, which is, so, not only do we provide the software to facilitate the exemption, but we also provide the software that enables towns to manage their TIF parcels. So this is just stepping through the tax department side of this equation. There's a much more involved application process that they have to go through with VEPC. But at the beginning of the TIF district, the town is required to identify every parcel in their TIF district. These parcels are reviewed and certified. PBR's involvement in the certification process is to ensure that all the parcels and values identified are consistent with the final grand list as submitted by the town. And once the parcels are finalized, all the parcels are recorded in the state's grand list software. Once a parcel is identified as being within the TIF district, it must always remain within the district. For example, this is just, an easy example. If a property owner within the TIF buys the property next door, the two properties will be merged into one active parcel. And this is part of sort of like the contiguous parcel law that exists in statute, right? So the taxpayer will only receive one bill for the full value of both properties. But for the purposes of TIF, both the original spans must remain so that the OTV of both properties can continue to be tracked. So in the TIF management program, the municipality would have to identify one of the parcels as inactive. So this is just how we're tracking this. And this is just a very, small example of some of the functionality that we're providing to towns. But acknowledging that scenarios such as this and many others are identified and explained in detail in the VEPC TIF district administrative rule. TIF statutes.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yep. One question.
Great, thank you. On the piece about the municipalities identifying one of the parcels that is inactive.
Mm-hmm.
Do they just pick one, or for purposes of bookkeeping, or is it the one that's not in the district that is inactive?
Sorry, so in this example, both of them were in the district. And how the town chooses which parcel will remain as the parent parcel is up to the town, I guess, and to their assessment practices. But it would be like if I bought my neighbor's house next door, right? I would have 2 1-acre lots. They both would have houses on them. but those two parcels would be, because of contiguous parcel law, those two parcels would be combined so that I would receive one tax bill. And here we're just indicating that the nuance with TIF is that we still need to track both the original parcel and the combined new parcel, so that we can keep track of the original taxable value.
Okay, great, thank you.
And then just acknowledging here that, you know, TIF statute and VEPSI rule inform how PBR manages and performs the TIF calculations. So we, you know, we defer to VEPSI for program administration and any sort of like questions. So, okay, this was just a quick presentation, and I think this is just in summary. VEPSI is the entity responsible for administration, oversight, and rulemaking for the TIF program. PBR is tasked with implementing the TIF statutes and rules as administered by VEPSI to ensure that municipalities can track and calculate the property increment and subsequent revenues associated with their TIF district. PBR enables the application of the TIF program. PBR enables the application of the TIF property tax exemption to the municipality's education grand list. And then we provide grand list and TIF district data to both VEPSI and the state auditor's office. So that's our short presentation. Any questions on PBR's role here? And then we can move to, I prepared an example of just like how, like sort of like stepping through what happened with
CLA.
Sorry, I'm like trying to
okay.
figure out how to not share. Stepping through an example of South Burlington's TIF district when they reappraised.
That would be a fantastic spot to transition to. Thank you, Chloe.
Okay, no problem.
And I'm sorry to have a person in a Teams environment have to move over to Zoom.
Oh, yeah, no, it's okay. I am this bad at Teams as well, honestly.
Good.
Okay, let me find my spreadsheet. Okay, share. So we'll start with just 1 year and let me know, is everyone able to see this?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Great. So, all right. Basically, South Burlington has a TIF district. It was established in 2012, which was also the year that their base values were set. So, and they reappraised in 2021. Their prior reappraisal was in 2006. So, and I guess high level, this is just a sort of an acknowledgement of the fact that, in fact, there is no specific treatment for TIF towns when they're undergoing a reappraisal, but I just thought it would be helpful to still sort of like step through the example. So here are sort of all our vital statistics for South Burlington. In the equalization study, sort of like that was completed in January, the year of their reappraisal, they had a CLA of 86. After their reappraisal was completed, a reappraisal CLA was calculated, which I don't know if folks are familiar with, but in the year that a town reappraises, there's sort of statutory language that indicates that the reappraisal CLA, the CLA that will be applied to education tax rates, which we call the reappraisal CLA, will be calculated as the town's new reappraised education grand list divided by their most recent equalized education grand list. So we sort of like come up with an interim CLA, right? Because it would be not great for the town if we were to apply their CLA that was calculated at the prior year equalization study to their new reappraised grand list, right? That would sort of be like they were getting penalized for their reappraisal. So in this case, we came up with they had a reappraisal CLA of 112%. Their tax rates, their education tax rates were as follows. 1.3 homestead, 1.4 non-homestead. I included their municipal tax rates as well.
Chloe, can you, for a second, how did you get to the 112? So you take is it 100 divided by 86.1? That doesn't really make it
No,
there.
sorry. So it would be their new education grand list.
Yeah.
Call it $4 million. Divided by their most recent equalized education grand list, which is one of the statistics of the equalization study. Basically how we determined their CLA from the most recent equalization study.
Yeah.
Okay. I can get you the exact, I can email you their specific calculation after if you would like to see it.
Great. Just trying to follow the math. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, I do have something that we could discuss in regards to the reappraisal CLA, but maybe we'll see how we do on the rest of this presentation first. So their base values were set again as of April 1st, 2012. Current values. So this is just, this is just a real life example of what we were just discussing in the basic presentation I just shared. So current values, we come up with their increment. We come up with South Burlington is eligible for a 75% retention percentage, which means that they get to retain 75% of the increment that's calculated. Again, the way that is done is through a property tax exemption, which is equal to the increment times the retention percentage. The proceeds, which is what the sort of like the town's vernacular for the amount of revenue they are able to retain from their TIF increment, is calculated, which is basically the exemption times the applicable tax rate. So again, you have to track things by homestead and non-homestead. So in this instance, the town was eligible to retain about $300K. I did also want to show that a portion of the increment does go to the education fund. That is 25% of the increment is applied to the education fund, as well as all of the revenue based on the original taxable value of the properties. So in this example, the education fund is receiving about $615K. So no special treatment here for like the reappraisal. And I did just want to walk through a 1-year example. And then if it's not going to totally blow everyone's mind, I can show you sort of like the 2 years before their reappraisal and 1 year following their reappraisal, just to give you an idea of sort of like the movement there.
I would love you to blow our minds, Chloe. That sounds great. And I just want to sort of flag for the committee that we probably only have 10 more minutes with Chloe.
Okay, great. So again, just now we're looking at this, but we're looking at the same data, but just for 4 years. And you can see here that South Burlington reappraised in FY22 or grand list year 2021. Same calculations throughout. And I think that, I think that one of the questions that the committee was sort of grappling with, which is like, what happens to sort of like the base values with a reappraisal, because those base values aren't adjusted. And therefore, in the year of the reappraisal, the town will see additional increment, assuming we're in an appreciating environment, right? And values are increasing. Current values will increase due to the reappraisal process. and therefore create some, you know, sort of additional increment, just based on the reappraisal. And that does hold to be true. But I think you have to imagine that this also it could go the other way with sort of like a depreciating market. And I think it is sort of a product of trying to sort of like smush TIF onto our statewide system. But so I did just want to acknowledge here that so prior to the reappraisal, the town was retaining about 200K. After the reappraisal, they were retaining about 300K. But I did just want to acknowledge that when you look at the total education fund revenue from the TIF district in line 32, which I just highlighted, it is fairly stable. So, and I think this has to do with the fact that you are also, tax rates are also being adjusted to sort of like account for the elevated grand list that South Burlington now has across the board. And maybe this will be a good spreadsheet for you guys to study further, if you are interested. So if we do only have 10 minutes, does anybody have any specific questions for us or information that we can come back to you with?
Lori, thank you. I noticed on one of your previous slides, you talked about VEPC having responsibility for rulemaking. Does PBR or any part of the tax department included in that as well? Do they have some rulemaking responsibility?
We don't have any rulemaking responsibility. And actually, you know, you can talk to VEPC about this when they come in, because they're actually working on updating their rules currently. We don't have any responsibility, but we did meet with them to sort of review their updates and offer sort of like suggestions, you know, in regards to sort of like program, in regards to like sort of the implementation of the program that the tax department is responsible for.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Anyone else? Thank you both.
No
So
problem.
much.
Good
That
luck.
was really helpful. Sort of level setting of a lot of different perspectives we've heard. Thank you.
No problem.
We'll see you soon, I'm sure. Thanks. Folks, we are gonna take a 9-minute break and then we'll be